Welcome back, everyone. We're delighted to have for the second paper in this mini workshop, Does Public Diplomacy Sway Foreign Public Opinion, Identifying the Effect of High-Level Visits by Benjamin Goldsmith, Yusaku Horiuchi, and Kelly Matush. So I believe Yusaku is taking the lead on the presentation of this paper, so please take it away.
Okay, thank you very much for giving us an opportunity to present our paper. So this is a paper with Ben Goldsmith from ANU and Kelly Matush from Florida State. And the title of this paper is Does Public Diplomacy Sway Foreign Public Opinion? So the many governments invest significant resources to communicate with foreign citizens. And this type of government-sponsored communication, often called public diplomacy, represents a prominent component of states' foreign policy today. And public diplomacy activities include government-sponsored educational exchange programs, state broadcasting outlets, and cultural events. And these efforts are aimed to shape global affairs through improving the perception of their leaders, country, people, and core values, and increasing support for specific policies. To put it differently, these diplomatic activities are aimed to increase soft power resources, which we have been discussing since the first paper. So the study of public diplomacy has bloomed into a substantial literature, but there is surprisingly little well-identified evidence about the effectiveness of public diplomacy. Can government actually sway the opinion of foreign citizens with such diplomatic efforts? So we argue that this fundamental question is essential to understand the impact of strategic transnational communication in modern international relations. So to answer this question, we emphasize the importance of expanding the scope of public diplomacy studies. Broad literature on soft power, as you know, is US-centric in its theoretical exposition. And empirical studies also tend to be based on single countries, most often the United States, or at most a few. This focus on single country studies or American soft power does not allow us to answer even basic theoretical questions about the general use of public diplomacy. For example, questions about Japan-China soft power competition, the topic of the first paper at this conference, or the impact of South public diplomacy. Those topics cannot be well addressed empirically without a general understanding of the efficacy of public diplomacy across countries. So to contribute to the literature of public diplomacy and soft power, we focus on a major and a ubiquitous tool of public diplomacy. That is, high-level political leaders' visits to other countries. So our study speaks to several important issues in international relations beyond public diplomacy. So transnational communication is seen as increasingly relevant to international power in the global information age. And establishing that leaders can shape public opinion abroad is a fundamental step to understanding how and when states achieve their foreign policy goals in this context. More broadly, public support is relevant to a wide range of international goals. For example, existing studies suggest that public opinion contributes to a state's policy on international trade, foreign aid, military coalitions, and military bases. As a result, cultivating foreign public goodwill may assist a state in shaping a partner state's ability to implement a desired policy across a wide range of policy realms. So leaders around the world devote significant amounts of their limited time to international travel. According to a recent study by Marlis and Smith, recent US presidents spent up to 1/3 of their time on international trips. The primary reason leaders travel internationally is to have a closed-door negotiation with host country leaders to discuss security and economic issues or other important issues. But during high-level visit, foreign leaders engage in extensive public outreach, directly addressing foreign audiences and attending public events in front of TV cameras. For example, visiting and host leaders may play catch. They may have sushi together at a famous restaurant, or they may enjoy playing golf together. Or the visiting leader may be invited to attend a sumo tournament. So why do they attend public events in front of TV cameras? Given the intense constraints on their time, the fact that visiting leaders often spend significant time on public outreach while abroad should suggest that they believe this type of public diplomacy brings substantial benefits. We argue that they engage in these public outreach and image building activities because visiting leaders want to influence foreign public opinion. In other words, these events outside closed-door meetings are part of their public diplomacy campaigns. There are two ways visiting leaders can sway foreign public opinion. First, a visiting leader tries to increase awareness of themselves and their country among citizens in the host country. Of many possible tools of public diplomacy, high-level visits are particularly well suited to gain the audience attention due to the large amount of media coverage they tend to draw. Second, they try to convey positive messages and images, often focus on the relationship with the host country and its leader. By sending these messages, they attempt to increase the likelihood that audience will view them, and by extension their country, favorably. But both pathways are contingent on two things. First, how the opportunity for public diplomacy are arranged. Usually, host leaders have their own domestic incentives to produce publicly visible and positive visit, which may show up their own domestic support. As invited guests of the administration in power, the visiting leaders typically enjoy some level of endorsement from their host, increasing their legitimacy in the eyes of the foreign public. Therefore, in most cases, the host leader's ability to direct domestic attention assists the visiting leader in their public diplomacy goals. Second, the second is how much and in what ways the media cover foreign leaders' visit. Given the mutually agreed nature of the visit and the incentives of both leaders, the media coverage of high-level visits tends to convey positive messages and images about the visiting leader. So if these conditions are not met, then a visit will not occur. So to put it differently, our theory predicts that when public diplomacy visits actually occur, it is likely that incentives of the visiting and host leaders are reasonably well aligned, and the news media are likely to produce some coverage of the visit. Therefore, a visit raises awareness of the visiting leader among citizens of the host country and convey positive messages about that leader to them. So given this theoretical expectation, our specific hypotheses are the following. High-level visits increase favorable perception of the visiting leader in that host country. They decrease indifference perceptions, and they decrease unfavorable perceptions. But by increasing awareness, we think that visit could increase positive attitude by moving respondents from indifference toward a positive opinion. By conveying positive messages, we also think that a visit could decrease negative attitude. To test these hypotheses, we leverage natural experimental situation and estimate causal effects of high-level visit using individual level opinion posts generated in the real-world environment at the time of high-level visits. Specifically, we use one of the most extensive cross-national and individual level data available, Get World polls. And specifically, the question we use for our analysis is, do you approve or disapprove of the job performance of the leadership of the name of a country? We combine this data set with our own original data concerning high-level visits by political leaders. The identification strategies for causal inference is to compare the respondents to this question between those who were interviewed just before the first day of a high-level visit and those who were interviewed just after. If there is no other systematic difference between respondents between these control and treatment groups, then we can estimate the causal effect by just simply taking the difference of means. So the combination of the two data sets provides an opportunity to identify the causal effect of visit by 15 leaders from 9 countries over 11 years to 38 countries. And we compare the approval or disapproval of the visiting leader among 32,456 respondents interviewed either just before or just after the first day of a visit. So this table shows the number of cases in our sample. And before showing the result of a statistical analysis, I'd like to focus on one specific case to illustrate our research design and some interesting findings. So a case for this analysis is Japanese Prime Minister Abe's visit to South Korea from November 1st to November 2nd in 2015. So Prime Minister Abe arrived in Seoul on November 1st, 2015. And within the 5 days before this date, 81 Korean adults happened to respond to the Get World poll instead of responding to the Get poll after the event, after the visit. And among them, 72.9% disapproved of the job performance of Abe, and only 17.6% approved of it. But within the 5 days after his arrival, 101 Korean citizens participated in this survey. And importantly, the percentage of disapproval dropped to 63.4%. The difference is 9% point. On the other hand, the percentage of approval increased to 20.8%. The percentage of indifference opinions also increased from 9.4 to 15.8. So these changes are consistent with our hypothesis. And for this particular case, these changes are statistically significant, even for these 182 respondents. What could explain these changes in attitudes among Korean people? There are some factors that could be consistent with our findings. The meeting between the leaders of Japan and South Korea in 2015 was the first meeting in the 3 years. There are many contentious issues, particularly the issue about the so-called comfort woman issue. But the leader of the 2 East Asian countries agreed to improve their relationship by continuing the dialogues between 2 countries. And the Prime Minister Abe and President Park also smiled and shook their hands. And these images were used in the media. But there are also some other factors that could be inconsistent with our findings. During the two-day visit, they only had 1 meeting and no joint statement was made. There was also no press conference, and typically visiting leaders participate in events to meet the general public or events to display their friendly relationship, but these events were not organized at all. But there was an unexpected event after the meeting. So one of the debates during the pre-visit arrangement between the 2 governments was to whether to have lunch together after the morning meeting on November 2nd. So the Korean government tried to set this lunch conditional on the Japanese government's pre-visit agreement to make a joint statement which would set the target date to find solutions for the comfort woman issue. But because Abe said no to such a compromise, President Park missed a chance to set a friendly lunch for public diplomacy. And after the meeting ended around 11:30 a.m., President Park asked Prime Minister Abe, "So what is your plan after this, before your departure?" And Abe said, "We'll have a Korean barbecue." And Abe went to a restaurant, not necessarily the very special restaurant in Seoul, with people from the Japanese embassy and other delegates. And we actually also know how much they paid. And they actually, total amount they paid was about $100 per person. So it's not that expensive. Oh, actually, it's expensive for us, but maybe not so expensive for the Japanese government. And importantly, this is the point. The barbecue lunch was widely covered by the media in Korea. The media criticized President Park for not welcoming the guest, which is against the Korean culture, while sympathy was directed toward the Prime Minister Abe. By having Korean lunch, instead of, for example, going to a fancy Japanese restaurant in Seoul, at a local restaurant that ordinary Korean citizens can go, Abe perhaps succeeded in mobilizing some favorable, at least not so hostile attitude among Korean citizens. So the example just explained may have some other idiosyncratic reasons why the effects are positive. So we pool all 86 cases like this example and estimate the average effect of a high-level visit. The statistical method is simple, ordinary statistical regression with a visit-specific fixed effects to see the variations within each visit. And we need to choose the number of days before and after the first day of the visit. For the main analysis, we choose 5 days, but we also show in our paper that effects are robust to slight change in this bandwidth. The outcome variables are approval percentage, disapproval percentage, and the percentage of respondents choosing neither approval nor disapproval. The treatment is simply whether respondents were interviewed before or after the first day of each visit. Our analysis shows substantial increase in approval of the visiting leader. This figure shows a 2.3% increase in approval on average across all 86 visits. The vertical bars represent 95% confidence interval. If they do not include 0, the coefficients are statistically significant and highlighted in red. The percentage of disapproval decreases by 1.4%. The percentage of indifferences also decreases, but it is very insignificant. The effect is substantially large. For example, the effects of approval percentage is roughly equivalent to 41% of average annual change of the approval percentage. And in addition to being substantively large, these effects are not fleeting. So to estimate their duration, we use a rolling average based on a 5-day bandwidth, gradually moving farther from the visit start. So 1 to 5, 2 to 6, 6 to 7. And we compare this with a fixed 5-day bandwidth control group immediately prior to the visit. So this figure shows these results for the 3 response categories. Again, statistically significant effects are highlighted in red. So most notably, the increase in approval for the visiting leader is enduring. This effect appears to last up to about 20 days from the start of the visit. The reduction in ambivalent responses also lasts for roughly 20 days. And the reduction in disapproval is relatively short-lived. So if indifferent views are more likely to be weakly held and based on low information, which is our theory, then the greater duration of the effect on these views suggests that any lasting impact of a high-level visit operates more through informing the uninformed than through persuading those who previously held a negative view of the visiting country or its leader. Now, if our theory is correct, a visit should influence public opinion not only if the media cover them. And in our primary results, we included all visits, regardless of whether we can confirm any media coverage of public diplomacy activities. But to test the media coverage effect, we divide all cases into two with or without evidence of public diplomacy, and then estimate the treatment effects separately. And then this figure shows, and the right panel shows that in case of evidence of media coverage of public diplomacy, there is a large and significant increase in approval and a significant decrease in other responses. But the left figure shows that if there is no evidence of public diplomacy, just simply no effect. So these results suggest the causal mechanisms involving visible public outreach and news media coverage. These are commonly assumed in the literature, help explain the effects we find. So given the time constraint, maybe I should skip the next two slides, but this figure is the first of the two figures showing our sensitivity checks. So in order to fully understand that these effects that we estimate are effects of public diplomacy, in this figure, we tried to exclude some cases of visit, like the visit with the announcement of foreign aid, the visit with certain kind of a threat or some other economic deals, because these deals or foreign aid or even military aid may change public opinion, but nothing to do with the public diplomacy. But after excluding these cases, we see the same results. And then this is another test. It's also called a leave one out test, sensitivity test. So the literature may suggest that the public diplomacy has some effects if the visitors are the US leaders. But in order to see whether this is driven by the effects of a particular country, we excluded one country one and after, and then we estimated effects, but the effects are still the same. So meaning that there is no single country driving the average effect that we produce, and I just presented. So these findings support the core and largely untested assumption behind most of the literature on public diplomacy. Public diplomacy actually sways foreign public opinion, period. And this is also the core assumption behind the argument that public diplomacy is an effective tool to increase a country's soft power resources. Okay? The effect we find is substantial, not short-lived, and not specific to the US. And given the time constraint, I decided not to introduce some additional results, but in the paper, we also present some results of exploratory analysis showing how much the effects are conditional on, for example, the relationship between the host and the visitors, and also the length of office, how long the visitor is in office, and some other the heterogeneous treatment effects. But if you have any questions, well, actually the paper is there, so please, if you are interested in those conditional effects, please read our paper. So we believe that our results provide potential avenues through which to better understand how public opinion forms on a range of important policy issues. And the impact of foreign public opinion and international outcome is closely tied to the ability to influence that opinion, which we demonstrate in this article. So we hope our findings will energize our further investigation into the nature of foreign public opinion formation and its downstream effects on policy outcomes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Horiuchi, for that presentation. So now we have three discussants, starting with Professor Christina Davis.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this workshop. Really, two great papers and a fantastic group. I really enjoyed reading the paper, and it is even more rich than this fantastic presentation we've just listened to. So while the paper cannot have the lovely display of Korean barbecue, it does have even more graphs, all clearly displaying a fantastic set of results. What I like about the paper is it's really nicely connected to the literature in soft power while moving forward by focusing in on a specific mechanism, not just public diplomacy, but the leader visits. And this is really quite interesting because when we think of soft power as sort of slow moving components like culture, it's harder to analyze. And so you both gain better research design and you gain better policy implications by honing in on this aspect of the leader visits. And so I really want to applaud them on that move for both theory and empirical research design. And the findings are really quite interesting to show that there's, an increase in public opinion favorability from a visit on the magnitude of 2.3 percentage points, which they show is large relative to the standard deviation you might see in the movement of how much you like Trump or how much you like Xi. And that's important. It's also fascinating that the visits are not rewarding the host. In many ways, I found that no finding for the host getting a leadership bump to be equally fascinating. And so I think you might want to think more about why that is, but it pays into their idea that it's increasing attention and appreciation where perhaps there was less information. And I guess the leader visit showcasing your own leader showing up at the sumo match doesn't add any new information about him. But that's very interesting. I did want to know, at a higher level of thinking about soft power as the ability to change opinion about outcomes, is the connection that you like the leader more, you like the country more, going to lead you to have policy preferences towards more cooperation? And that might be the next paper. This paper is already good. I just want to give 4 quick suggestions of areas that could be improved. I think that you could clarify first, what is the appropriate comparison? Is your counterfactual just that there's no visit? To some extent, I think the richness of the paper is trying to separate pomp from policy. And the idea of just the visit where you pose for pictures in the camera, as opposed to policy. And yet, in some ways, that's disturbing when you say that offering economic aid or announcing an agreement is not public diplomacy. Where I would have thought public diplomacy is very much about delivering promises of specific cooperation. And so anyways, I think it'd be helpful to try and think about that if you're looking at non-visit, or if you're thinking about within the visit, what share is it, how much you offer, the agreements versus just showing up and looking sociable and smiling. And certainly you'd want to look at the tone of the agreements. I mean, last week's visit in Alaska was not exactly a positive meeting of all smiles when we think about the Chinese foreign minister and Tony Blinken's engagement. So you might want to think more about what are the tones of the agreement. Second, how do the regime types differ? So if you're thinking about the meetings, you talk about how it shows shared values. You might draw more on the Trevor and Serti et al. First paper we've just been discussing about how can a mismatch of values make soft power possibly even result in a backlash. And so if you were to think about how does an authoritarian democratic dyad have a different response to public diplomacy than if it were democratic. And that might get at this, are you telling us something different, reversing stereotypes, or because you're different, you're coming and you're criticizing, in which case you might see backlash. And so you might actually have stronger effects if you were to sort of parse out these potential different effects. 3, since we're all interested in Japan, I had to read through the appendixes, which are quite long and detailed, and you go through all of the sensitivity tests to taking out countries. And when you take out the leader visits by Japan, it attenuates the effect size from 2.2 to 1.9. Now, if I'm interpreting this correctly, it means that actually Japan gets a lot from its visits. And China was the other country that appears to have, taking China out of your pooled results attenuates the average effect, but maybe I read it too quickly there. And then the last point that's really interesting, if you're trying to go further on some of the details, what is a visit? Are you having different types of heterogeneous treatment effects when you have the flyover meeting versus the 3-day, we're going to stop? And you show that many of the visits are actually 0 nights, meaning it was just a quick stopover, whereas others could be 3 days. And I'm a little worried when you're always measuring interviews as after the first day. Sometimes the leader has already made their press release and left. Other times they're just in the midst and the press is still rolling on an ongoing visit. And so I think you might want to separate that out. But those are in the details. I think overall it's really a fantastic paper. And also Naima is much more qualified to think about public diplomacy and soft power. So I should yield the floor.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Christina. Yeah, we will move on to soon-to-be Professor Naima Green-Riley.
Thanks so much. Well, I will echo what Christina said by saying that I very much enjoyed reading this piece. I'd seen an earlier draft of this that was shorter, but this version really goes deep on the question of how foreign leader visits affect public opinion about the leader's job performance. And I think that the paper makes a lot of really important contributions, right? Because there isn't very much empirical work on the effects of public diplomacy right now. The data set and the way that the authors manipulate the timing of the interview is innovative and creative. And so I have a few comments. I'm going to divide them into theoretical comments and then some empirical comments. First, theoretical comments. So you say in your hypothesis section that the majority of messages about a foreign leader that are in the media during any visit will be positive. And I think that that particular point is a point that gave me the most sort of angst and the thing that I probably disagreed with the most. And the reason I disagreed with that is I think that I worked in some places where we have hard relationships, right? But China and Egypt, I know that when we had leader visits, we were always fighting the media. Like, don't publish that because that's not true. Don't lie about the leader. Don't say things that make the leader look bad. And so that relationship between the media and the public diplomats is definitely not one always that's just one of joy. And more related to your paper, I don't think that the media coverage will always be positive. Definitely when practitioners read this paper, they would also disagree with that point really strongly. So to fix that, I think if you just said that the news coverage of the country and the leader increases around the time of the visit and didn't necessarily make that statement that, and on the whole, the coverage is going to be positive, at least we know that there will be sort of this increase in attention towards the country. That's probably true. Secondly, you mentioned the host country leader has an ability to constrain the public diplomacy success of the visiting leader in the theory section, and you go into detail about how there have been negotiations between like the US and the Chinese on how much public diplomacy one of the leaders can do on a trip. But then when I got to the empirical side, I didn't necessarily see any sort of discussion about that type of a thing, right? So the host leader trying to constrain the visiting leader's public diplomacy didn't really show up in the empirics. The paper is really rich. I don't know that my suggestion is to add more empirics that get to that point, because I'm not sure if your data lends itself to doing that. But I do think that by raising that issue and then not talking about it in the empirics more, I had a bunch of questions that then were unanswered and probably could have been avoided if maybe that part weren't in there, because it's not really a part of your empirics anyway. At the end of the paper, you make the point about the credibility of the visiting leader as measured through the amount of time that the leader's been in office. So really there's like a section on the length of time. It's flipped in that the section is about the length of time the visiting leader has been in office, but then you make sort of a statement that, oh, well, it could show that credibility matters. And I'm not necessarily sure that credibility stems from how long a leader's been in office, right? So having been in office could, for many leaders, actually lead to a negative effect of their credibility, depending on what they do when they're in office. So those are the theoretical comments. For empirics, I wondered why in your robustness checks, when you add in covariates, you only added in the covariates of the variables that were not balanced. I recognize the empirical reason for including definitely the covariates that aren't balanced, but even the covariates that are balanced in the samples would be interesting to have in those regression results, just because we're still learning about public diplomacy. So any information we can have about what different features of people and respondents matter to public diplomacy efforts, I think is good. I would love to see some information on the baseline job assessment or job performance assessment of the 15 leaders around the world in the host countries that you study, and then see evidence from you all that the average job performance of the leader in the countries where you selected, so there are, I think, 38 countries that you did your analysis, as opposed to the job assessment for those leaders sort of globally, is not different, right? So what I really want to see is that in the countries that you select, there's a lot of them, so there's a good chance that this will work out fine. But in those 38 countries, they're not more likely to be liked already. That makes sense, on average. And then last thing I'll say, I have more comments, but I'll send them to you because I don't want to spend too much time, is I'm curious about whether there might be a bias toward Democratic leaders in your data. So I was just looking at the visits that you include in the data set, and it seemed like there might be more trips by Democratic leaders in the data set than trips by autocratic leaders. And if so, that might be the case. And if that's the case, I think you should discuss that. I think you should say, our data set skews if it does. Here's a place where that might matter also. So in addition to the fact that we just want to know that fact because that's your data set and we want to understand what the data set is, there was a part of the analysis where you look at places where the visits were covered by the media versus when they weren't. And the coverage by the media was measured through sort of like this Factiva search of English language sites. You mention in a footnote that we know that there are some problems with not including local press and only looking for English level news or English language news reports in the footnote. But I would assume that you're writing that because the visit could have been covered by local press and you don't know, and so you're not including the right countries in your subsample. Another problem with that is that if you're only looking at English language news sources, then I wonder if your subsample is now more likely to be more favorably inclined towards Democratic leaders. And if your entire data set of foreign leaders tends to be more democratic than it is autocratic, then you've got some bias there. I'm gonna stop there. I'll send you the rest via email.
Great, thank you so much. And then finally, we have Professor Tetsuro Kobayashi.
Thank you again. So I'll keep it brief because I already made some comments on the first paper. So I have one methodological comment and the other is perhaps more theoretical. For the first one, I might have missed in your presentation or in the paper, but I think there's some sort of the endogeneity issue, because before the high level visit, of course, there's going to be a lot of careful planning. Right. So Xi Jinping, has a plan to visit Japan and, of course, to the US. But his visit to Japan hasn't been realized because, the bilateral relationship is not so friendly now. So in other words, they, the host country and visiting country, they both, carefully plan in advance to make this kind of, positive impact of visiting to be realized. So in other words, the cases where there's some kind of backlash or negative impact would have been censored already. So in other words, there are only cases. So we can only observe the cases where positive consequences are reliably expected. So if that is the case, basically is the outcome. I mean, the positive impact on public opinion is defining what cases are going to be observed. So I wonder how you could deal with this kind of potential endogeneity issue. Relatedly, so you frame this visit as kind of high rank officials visit, but my related question is how high it should be. So Christina already mentioned about the Alaska meeting. So that's also the visit of the Chinese high-rank officials to the U.S., but it was not a president versus president meeting. And then the end result was really not really friendly. So does it have to be the country leader, like a president or prime minister, or do we observe the similar effect for those like at the ministry level visits? The theoretical question is about the mechanism behind this effect. So overall, I had an impression that the most of the effect is coming from kind of a name recognition effect, because not many people know about foreign leaders, but when they visit their own countries, it's going to be reported and covered by media. So that's basically for the first time people realize, oh, this is a good guy and good leader. So I like him or I like her, right? But there might be other potential mechanisms. For instance, in many visits, the visitors bring some kind of gifts or souvenirs, right? So, okay, we're going to give you this foreign aid, or we're going to have this, economic trade deal, and so on. So these are, again, so carefully crafted in advance of the visit. And can we differentiate the effects of name recognition from the effect of more substantial souvenirs? If the name recognition is very strong, I guess you can test it with your own very unique, interesting data set, because some people visited the same country for multiple times. For instance, from your table, I can see that Angela Merkel visited Belgium for 4 times, for instance. If the name recognition effect is the primary source of this effect, then the impact would, basically decrease in the second time, 3 times, 4 times, because they all know Merkel already, right? So you can, I don't know if it's technically possible, but you may be able to capitalize on this multiple visits by the same visitor to the same country. Okay, I think I should stop here. So thank you very much for this very interesting study. I think, so as other discussants, I was so much impressed because this is a really unique data set, and a combination of the 2 sources of data set, and the findings has a huge implication, I guess. Thank you.
Great, thanks to the discussants. We have already a great line of people wanting to give comments. So I'll read out the list and then I'll put it in the chat so that people can just follow the list. It's Michael Tees, Amy Katalinic, Philip Lipsy, Mike Toms, Jennifer Lind, and Hikaru Yamagishi. So starting with Michael.
Okay, thanks. That was a great paper and a great presentation, Yusaku. Thanks. A couple of points. First, on Christina mentioned that she was surprised that there didn't seem to be any sort of coattails effect in terms of approval of the host leader. And I'm wondering if that might not be, and I guess part of the reason that's surprising is because why invite the visitor if you're not going to get something out of it? I wonder if there might be countervailing effects there, sort of a possibility of a coattail kind of basking in the glow of the celebrity who's visiting, but also the possibility that you sort of pale by comparison in the joint press conferences or whatever other sorts of events there are, and you sort of end up in the shadow and you're diminished. And I wonder if there's a way you could tease that out in looking at these surveys, if there are questions that may give you priors on sort of the relative respect that the host leader and the visitor have, or something like that, to kind of get a sense that maybe there are effects working in both directions. But the other question I have is more of a methodological one, and that's I love this natural experiment of did the survey response happen before or after the visit started? But I wonder if it's actually unambiguous that that's really the best cutoff point. So, especially insofar as media coverage is a big part of the mechanism, on some of these visits, there's a lot of media coverage on the run-up to the visit, about the preparations, things like that. And that may affect the responses of people who are just answering these questions in the Gallup World Survey whenever they were answering them, such that maybe the first day of the visit is not the right cutoff point. And I wonder if you've moved that around a little bit, maybe something relative to when mentions of the visit really started to ramp up in the local media or something like that, as the question of sort of when the respondent in the survey was kind of primed by the visit, as opposed to the actual events of the visit. At that point, some of those might even be anticlimax at some point. So just wondering if you looked at that. Thanks.
Hi, so shall I just jump in? Yeah, so thank you for this great paper, another stellar project in this area from you. I teach your other work, so I was excited to read this one. So I have two comments. The first comment is that my colleagues at NYU have published a paper that you cite in your paper about why leaders visit other countries, and I know this paper well. And they sort of make this claim that if a foreign leader visits another country, it sends a signal that they expect that the incumbent in the other country will be in power for the foreseeable future. So a visit from a foreign leader can help to prevent domestic opponents in the host country from attacking the incumbent or criticizing the incumbent, trying to depose the incumbent. So this suggests, I was just thinking about for your project, it suggests that, leader visits, I mean, you're not saying that they're random, but it suggests that leader visits may be more about the need for fending off domestic opponents, or the incumbent may sort of invite leader visits when they feel weakened or they feel like, their hold on power is tenuous. And I just wonder if it was worth thinking about whether there's any causal pathway potentially there between the need for a visit and on the part of the host country and attitudes in that host country toward the sending country. So that's my first point. And then the second point was just conceptually, I was expecting the question to be sort of more about the favorability of the country, or the attitudes toward the country or favorability of the leader. But instead it's, do you approve or disapprove of the job performance of the foreign leader? And that just that seems a little like people don't have views often of the job performance of their own leaders, let alone, the views of the job performance of foreign leaders. So I'm just wondering if this is a situation where, you never, so like the public in the United States never see Stephen Harper doing his job, and then suddenly they see Stephen Harper doing his job by visiting their leader and shaking hands and I'm just wondering if this is more like people don't have information, so they're indifferent, and then they move toward having information which induces a positive attitude. And your results seem, consistent with, there's evidence that it's indifference moving to less indifference rather than people holding kind of negative views. So I just wanted to raise those 2 points. But overall, it's a really great paper, and I enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed seeing that picture of the yakiniku. Thank you. Feeling quite depressed right now, but.
I think I'm next. So I also enjoyed this paper a lot, and I think it's a really cool approach to this question. So 2 points. So the first is about the kind of substantive conclusion, and just looking at this from an IR perspective, I didn't really buy the idea that this is sort of a substantively important effect, which is not to subtract from the paper. I think the paper is fine. But kind of framing this as a sort of an important big effect, I felt like didn't sit well with me. So it's basically a 2% change in the public opinion of a foreign country for 20 days. And so, that kind of magnitude of change could matter if you're running a domestic election with a certain kind of electoral rule, but it's the foreign citizenry, and that marginal difference is really not going to have an impact on any kind of policy outcome that we care about. And so to me, the punchline here is it does have an effect, but it's not really going to matter for anything. And I think that's still fine in terms of the paper, because you're measuring something and it might have other important effects, but I didn't quite agree with the way the paper was framing the findings. And the second one was Christina's comment, I think very similar. But the Appendix K coding of the visits that came with sort of a policy outcome struck me as maybe being too strict. Like it seems like just subjectively thinking about these visits, there's usually some press conference where the leaders are saying, this is what we talked about and this is the progress that we made. And so maybe, the coding is a little bit limiting in that sense. Like there weren't any of those that included Japan. And it's hard for me to think of a Abe visit that doesn't come with some kind of policy announcement, right? It raises questions like, why are they there? If there's nothing of policy substance that's coming out of the meeting. And so I worried a little bit there. And so it might be worth talking, maybe there are visits like that. But it left me with some questions. And so maybe that could be addressed as well. I have some more stuff that I'll send separately. A great paper, thank you.
Great, Mike Toms is next.
Great. Well, I thought this was just a fascinating paper. I learned a lot from reading it. It was very thought-provoking. I have a bunch of comments, but I'm going to just give you kind of two clusters of comments, one about moderators and one about treatments. So my moderator's comment is an effort, I think, to connect the two papers on today's panel by suggesting that a key moderator that's maybe not explored in this paper so far is the politicization of a dyad. So if the first paper on today's panel is correct, then efforts to increase soft power, including by diplomatic visits, should depend on whether the dyadic relationship between the countries is politicized or not. One way that you could test that would be by estimating pre-existing levels of hostility or favoritism between the countries, and or with the public opinion data you have, looking at the pre-visit popularity of the foreign leader as a measure of the moderator. But let me deepen that point a little bit, because I worry that your estimates are probably an upper bound on the positive effects of diplomacy. You describe what you're doing in the study as a natural experiment. And I guess at some level, whether a respondent answers the survey before or after the visit is as if random. But the thing that's not random is the visit itself. Guests have to be invited and guests have to accept. So let's suppose that guests who aren't welcome won't be invited. And let's suppose that guests who think that their visit might not help or might backfire probably won't accept the invitation. Then those two things are going to limit the generalizability of your findings. It's as if the subset of the visits that we actually observe are best cases for a positive effect of diplomacy. So anyway, that's my attempt to connect the two papers together. My second comment is about what counts as a treatment. And I guess I have two small things to say here, but one builds on something that Michael already mentioned, because he was wondering what counts as a treatment, the first day of the actual visit or something else. I have two suggestions there. One would be to actually study the effects of pre-visit publicity, if you can. And the second would be to point out that given the methods that you use, any pre-visit publicity effects are going to make it harder for you to detect the effect of an actual visit. So to the extent that there's bias in the estimates, the bias is going to be against finding an effect on the day of the visit. So even if you can't study it, you can at least sign the bias caused by not being able to consider those types of effects. The other thing that I was puzzled by on the treatments is that you find, based on the graphs, that the peak impact of a visit occurred around 15 or 16 days after the visit, and then declined very sharply in the next 5 days. So my question for you is, what theory of persistence and decay could actually explain that kind of pattern? If, for example, the effects persisted because they learned something about the foreign leader, then why would they dissipate so sharply within 5 days after day 16, for example? So a little bit of thinking about pre-treatment effects, but also about the post-treatment effects and how those could be theoretically motivated, I think would help strengthen what's already an excellent paper. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Jennifer Lind is next.
Hi, everyone. So everybody's talking about this paper is great. This paper is so well written. It's so clear. It was just a real joy to read. So seriously, congratulations on really writing just a model paper in terms of it was so easy to take in. And one thing that you might want feedback on is the precision and the models and the statistics. I'm definitely not that person. I'm not going to give Yusaku statistical advice. But another thing to get feedback on, I always ask myself, what do we now know about the world after reading this paper? And so there I can definitely give you some advice. I guess I had some of the same reactions as Phil in terms of what have we learned specifically about things that the world cares about? I think you have to bolster that case in the piece. Again, the thing that the world cares about is how a country can persuade another country to do something. This notion of through attraction or persuasion and so on. And you associate that with, I think quite sensibly, theoretically, with the concept of soft power. So again, perhaps the argument is a country that has more soft power will be able to negotiate a more favorable trade agreement, or will be able to convince its ally to take on more burden sharing responsibilities, for example. But again, in the paper, that thing, there's no evidence of that. There's no evidence that the leader's public diplomacy affected this outcome, which is ultimately the outcome that we care about. So I think you need to bolster that case to address the Phils and the Jennies who are in your readership. So I think one place that you can do this is in the intro, like on page 3, you talk about public diplomacy may assist a state in shaping the partner state's ability to implement a desired policy across a wide range of policy realms. So this notion that it helps the other country's government build the case for being more helpful to the other state and so on. So I think that's really promising. But again, that's a pretty weak statement. Oh, it might do that, right? So you got to show us some evidence that it does that. Or also on that page, the paper cites different articles talking about how public opinion contributes to a state's policy on a variety of issues. And then there are a bunch of citations. I think that's where you can really fortify your case. I think you really need to build up the case to people who aren't familiar with those papers and what they found and what they argued in what context, because that's the key finding that people care about, that makes this paper really interesting, which is if that leader visits and gets that resulting favorable opinion, that's going to lead to a better outcome, a better policy outcome for that leader's country. And then let me just quickly raise 2 issues. By the way, I'm going to send you guys comments, written comments, so that you don't have to write down everything. 2 issues that I thought were really interesting takeaways from this paper that they're currently not kind of front and center. I thought they were really interesting. The role of the media, as you did talk about, the role of the media is like a filter, plays a really important role here. It's the way that people learn about the visit, and presumably there's a narrative that's told. First, one question I had was, how do you have the figure in the presentation about to the extent that there was media coverage, what are the effects? I was wondering how you operationalize media coverage. This in general, this made me think about in settings where the media are state controlled. Does that mean that if a leader visits a country with state controlled media, then that is going to make it better or worse or so on? Is public diplomacy still going to help in those settings? And I think that's a particularly interesting question to ask in this day and age where we're looking at a rivalry between an authoritarian country and a democratic one. And then a second point, again, something that I thought was really interesting from your paper that I would be interested in you guys exploring, maybe in a different paper. As Christina said, I was really interested in the fact that this was not helpful for the host leader. Why not write that up? I actually think a lot of us have the sense, just, stuff we come upon when we're doing our random reading for papers. We learn about, like, was it like Helmut Kohl was up for an election, and so he wanted Reagan to visit. That's when the whole like Bitburg Cemetery thing happened. But I remember like reading like Helmut Kohl really thought this was going to be helpful for him to have Reagan visit. It's really interesting if you guys find no evidence for that. So again, that strikes me as being quite a different paper. I'm not even sure it's IR. It kind of is, but who cares? But anyway, I think that leaders do think that this is helpful for them, that it makes them look statesmanlike or whatever. And, at the very least, if you don't write a paper on it, I think it would make a really cool op-ed to be deployed at an appropriate time. Thanks.
Thanks. Hikaru is next.
Hi, so my point was similar to, in essentially the same as Mike Tom's, but it's this idea of selecting on the dependent variable. So I was looking at page 16 on the paper where you say, because of the timing of the GWP sampling timing is not something that the government will have taken into account strategically, that it's as if random. I just wanted to clarify that I think that that is true. But if we think of the distribution of timing before you have sampled relatively randomly here, I think that distribution might be skewed on various things like expectations of host and visitor teams of this being successful. The host, and that could entail things like media freedom. So if the host country can control the narrative, it's a safer visit. It could be things like, Mike suggested politicization level originally. Hostility level. This kind of comes back to our paper too, because it's about how politicized things are to begin with. But I think you can do these kind of pseudo balance tests. But it would also, I think, even if you can't, balance, say that these things are balanced with these various measures, just looking at randomly sampling some of the cases and seeing how these visits are actually planned, to me, it's a warning sign that it's very choreographed. No one would go if it's going to be a true disaster situation. So actually seeing if there's some sort of risk associated with going and so on would make the case, I think, convincing in terms of the overall distribution before you sample.
Great, thanks. So I want to take this time to read two quick Q&A questions from the audience. I'll kind of briefly give my 2 cents. And Michael, is your hand still raised? Did you have another comment, Michael Tees?
Oh no, sorry.
No, okay. Oh, yeah. Tejo also, okay. So let me. I'll read these 2 comments. I'll give my 2 cents, and then we'll go to Tejo. So from Shoko Watanabe in the audience. Hi, my name is Shoko. I think one of the most important things of public diplomacy is whether the prime minister speaks good English or other languages. For example, Prime Minister Abe used to study USC, and his English and pronunciation wasn't good. If future prime ministers can speak English well, I think their approval might increase more. Another attendee noted that they wanted to know more about future developments in this research and what areas will come into focus. I'll just briefly say, so I really enjoyed reading this paper. It's fantastic, very well written paper, and really interesting findings. And most of what I was going to say, I think, has been said already. I'll just put maybe a slightly different gloss on it, which is, first this question, seems like the core to understanding the paper is what's the big theoretical takeaway. And I just wanted to know more, I guess, about the paper has a little bit of the flavor of, the reason the leaders are doing this is in order to increase foreign public opinion. But elsewhere, you're careful to note, of course, that there are other objectives for these leaders. But it's, as I think Jenny and Phil are pointing out, it's not clear if it's exactly rational for leaders to go and participate in these meetings if what they're getting is this 2% bump, which is big, as you point out, it's big and important in the context of public opinion swings, but understanding the kind of payoffs for it are for the leaders and what they're trying to do would be interesting. I guess the way that I had thought about reading this paper was there's this really interesting bump in public opinion that's probably not the primary objective of these leaders when they're making these visits. And the other thing I just noticed, this questions, I think that, starting with Naima raised this question about like what's happening in the local media environment, and just some more qualitative detail on that in the paper that explained what's happening, especially before the visits and after the visits in terms of media coverage, for me would help answer that. But what a fantastic paper! I really enjoyed reading it. Tejo.
Thank you. I also want to thank for the three authors to provide a very interesting paper. I just want to suggest you think about three kinds of different state visits. One is a meeting between enemies. In this case, you try to send someone or invite to make sure to agree to disagree. In that case, a public diplomacy will not be easy. The second meeting is a state visit between alliance or very close friends. This meeting is planned already based upon a successful relationship. President Obama's visit or inviting President Lee Myung-bak in 2011, Trump's visit or invitation to Abe in 2017. So already a public diplomacy is working well, and the state visit will maximize its expected public diplomacy. Final one is a tricky one. Send someone or invite someone to make your opponents on your side, or to drive a wedge your visitor and the visitor's alliance. Xi Jinping's relationship with the current South Korean president to drive a wedge between Korea and Japan. So future expected meeting between Xi Jinping and the Japanese leader during Summer Olympic game, or future Xi Jinping and the Biden's meeting, this one will be very difficult because already there is very small room for public diplomacy. So I suggest you think about three different meetings. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Does anybody from the paper want to respond to any of the comments so far?
Kelly, please.
Yeah, I mean, an overwhelming set of really, really awesome comments and questions. And I really appreciate all this. I think it's really exciting to think about, where we can go next with this project and the paper. One thing that I'd love to talk about more is how we're interpreting these results. I think that we are not meaning to say that any leader could go to any public and expect a positive effect, right? And we're talking about the incentives of the media and the host leader and those conditions. I think we're precisely talking about some of the selection effects that you guys are concerned about, right? So I don't think that we mean to say that because we find it in the sample that we have, we think that this should, apply to any potential visit, right? Would you say that's right? But I take your point very seriously about how we should consider this a high estimate and how we should think about the distribution of cases that we do have and how that might apply. I don't even know where to start. Thank you very much for all of these feedback.
Yeah, I'll just also say quickly, thank you very much. This is really, really useful and important feedback for us. And the points about the broader theoretical connection to the IR literature is something we tried to emphasize, but clearly is not coming through well enough. So that's something that I think we can revisit. we do. I mean, with the issue of the endogeneity question and the planning of the visits, I did just want to maybe push back or ask for a bit more comment on that point. I mean, yes, the visits are planned, and we acknowledge that, and there may be consideration of how it will be received among the visiting, the public in the host country. But if there is an endogeneity effect there, it is not exactly our treatment effect in the sense that we may think the public would be more receptive to the visit, or the planners of the visit may think the public would be more receptive. But if the planning is well, we think relations are going well, and so opinion is already high or is already focused on a particular country, that doesn't necessarily relate to the before and after treatment effect. I mean, it might be that if a country is off the radar, or if there are negative views about a country, a visit would have a greater effect than it would in an environment where it's where the planning has gone through and the case has been chosen, or the visit's been chosen because relations are already relatively good.
I just want to say thank you, everyone, for all of these comments. And because I was presenting, I couldn't see, the comments there, but I look forward to reading all of these after this event. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think with that, we've, on the U.S. side, we're heading deeper into the night. I know that some of you are also in Europe, where it's already the middle of the night. Of course, if you're in Asia, you're just beginning what I hope is a good and fruitful day. So I just want to thank all of you for a really fantastic, lively discussion of these two papers. I want to thank, Yusaku, Amy, and Ben for a really exciting paper, and especially the discussants, Christina Davis, Naima Green-Riley, Tetsuro Kobayashi, Maria Repnikova, Jonai, it's late enough now that I'm forgetting our third discussant, Professor Tago. Sorry, Professor Tago. But thanks all of you for this great lively discussion. Hope to see you all again, hopefully in person in the near future. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.